Yeah.
We can. Can you make it a little bigger? Yeah, great.
Wow. What
Yes,
nice photos.
yes.
Okay, I think we have February boys, Swapi and Sharat, and
Hmm.
so we'll send this song later to them. I don't think they joined today.
Yeah, Sharat not going to be there.
H-A-P-P-Y, birthday, birthday, birthday. H-A-P-P-Y, birthday, birthday, birthday. H-A-P-P-Y, birthday, birthday, birthday. H-A-P-P-Y, birthday, birthday, birthday. ये मेरी अदा है, ये मेरा है स्टाइल. ये मेरी अदा है, ये मेरा है स्टाइल. जो सरप्राइज हो गए हो तुम. Now don't growl, just smile. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear stupid.
Stupid.
Happy birthday to you.
Okay, that is a birthday song for the boys.
Nice. Srinivas, you find very hearty birthday songs.
Yeah. So now we'll move on to the choices for the what Trivi is curated for the reading in the month of February for the March session. Like we have Rama on romance, we have Trivi obviously for innovation. So he is going to drive this, and he suggested 3 books for us, which the survey will begin later in the day, and the members can choose what book they want to read. Some of them are very, very interesting and deep, and they really touch the nerve of innovation. Okay, now we'll move on to the session, and today's session is on romance.
Beautiful. Very nice. Let me extend a very warm welcome to our guest speaker today, Professor Jayashree Kamble, who has kindly agreed to join us. And Rama, as the reader of the month, will introduce her. So go ahead, Rama. Hello, Rama. Can
Yeah, I
you
had
hear?
muted. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, now we can hear you. Go ahead.
So I was saying that as I began the process of thinking through how would make this a memorable session, I was looking for scholars in this area, and I came across Professor Kamble's background and the work she had done. And not only has she brought her love of romance literature and film to LaGuardia students, where she is a professor, she's now bringing the same love to us as a book club.
Mhm.
And you can obviously read a lot about her. If you've not, do take a moment to listen to the previous interview which Trivi circulated, or to the interview on YouTube which Chacha had circulated. But what I liked really is she says that a good romance novel uses accessible language and long-standing convention, but still surprises and delights you, often for while striving for more inclusive representation of different identities. And I'd like to use that to basically request Dr. Kamble to talk about her scholarship as well as what drove her for this passion in life and share those thoughts with her. Beyond that, she comes from Pune. She studied there, did a doctorate in literature in the US, and of course now enthralls and enlightens hordes of students at LaGuardia Community College as part of the City University of New York. Dr. Kamble, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that very welcoming, very warm introduction. I really appreciate everyone being here. Thank you, Rama, Milinji, everybody for inviting me. And I'm thrilled that your book club is reading romance in a broad sense this February. It's always a pleasure to see people get introduced to the genre, and I hope that I can provide some context. I'm going to put myself a little timer here because professors can talk endlessly about their chosen topics, even when other people are clearly falling asleep. So it's a good it's a good mechanical reminder to not go overboard. Just to give a little bit of a quick background, as Rama just said, I studied partly at Pune. I'm originally from Bombay. I did my sort of till the 12th standard. I was studying in Bombay before we moved to Pune, and then I finished my bachelor's and my master's degree there. And I've been a romance reader pretty much all my life. I would say probably from the age of 10 or 11. So I've been reading romance in one form or the other for 35 something years. And romance, especially in India, as most of you may know, is identified with the one particular publishing house, but it's almost spoken of in the same way that one would say Xerox for all copiers or Band-Aids for all plasters. So Mills and Boon is often sort of equated with the entire genre, but it is in fact a very specific publisher. And India and the most of the former British Empire sort of knows romance by that particular publisher's name. So that's how I kind of grew up reading romance. In the US, the same novels from the same publisher were republished as Harlequin romances. So Harlequin was a North American distributor. They were actually Canadian, and they started republishing the Mills and Boon romances under the Harlequin imprint across North America, and then eventually bought out Mills and Boon. But a lot of Americans think that Harlequin is actually an American company. It's originally Canadian, and then it was bought by a multinational corporation, which is what currently owns it. And then the publishing of it sort of became much more diverse. So it went from the small books that, again, many of you, whether you read them or not in India, will recognize. They're about 180 pages. They have a very particular cover image, and the story follows a fairly tight structure. But that started probably before World War One, and then it sort of solidified as a form around the 50s and 60s. And when it makes a transition over into the United States, the form actually becomes much longer, acquires a lot more subgenres, and so on. So if we can just quickly move to the next slide, I wanted to show folks a little bit of a representation of what the form can look like. And again, this is my area of study. I study English language, mass market, romance novels, and I'm that particularly means it's a 20th century mass market form. It's form in multiple modes, so hardcover, paperback, audio, and ebooks. And again, some of the names people recognize are Harlequin, Mills and Boon, In the US, it's Avon as well as Kensington, and there's many others, there's Berkeley and so on. The way we sort of talk about romance novels in this mass market form is that they have to have certain key traits. So there's a focus on a romantic relationship, either being established for the first time, and it's usually between a couple, so a pairing, though that also has changed in the last few years. You find polyamorous relationships, you find what would be identified as ménage à trois, three people, or called a throuple. And sometimes you'll find that it's about reestablishing a relationship. So maybe it failed the first time around, and when the novel starts, we're actually seeing the couple, they come into contact again, or they're trying again, and so on. So that's kind of the core idea behind something being identified as a romance novel in this particular form of commercial fiction. We often also say that really the other key trait needs to be that it has to have a hopeful and happy ending. And it used to be called HEA, or Happy Ever After. Now there's also a space made for something called HFN, which is Happy for Now. So it doesn't have to end in marriage, which it used to be the case, but we have to have a sense as readers that these people will be happier together than they will be apart. By the end, we have to be convinced of that. So sort of the key rule for something to be a romance novel, the romance novels I study, is that people cannot die and they can't split apart. So if that is in fact the case, then we call it a love story, or you can call it romantic, but it doesn't fall into the fairly strict category of a romance novel. But you can see from some of the covers I've given that they can look different sometimes. They can have, the first cover is often what's called a clinch cover. So you actually see people in the moment of intimacy or just before they kiss. They may be partially undressed, and then oftentimes people identify romance novels with that appearance. But you can have one person on the cover, and the second one that I've given you there shows you just the one model. Or you can have a more sort of fairy tale like looking cover. Or you can, for a while, we had a bunch of novels that were sort of published as chick lit, but they also had the sort of romance trajectory in them. But that's more like the Bridget Jones Diary kind of era, or Sex and the City, etc. So there's a fair amount of variety within the genre itself, and there are tons of subgenres. So the sort of one of the origins of this form actually is similar to some of the choices that y'all are reading for your book club this time. So Jane Eyre and my cousin Rachel actually come out of the line of descent called the Gothic and the Gothic romance. And so that subgenre still exists in a particular form, but it's called like romantic suspense. So there's like a mystery, there may be a murder, there's a problem that has to be solved while the romantic plot is also unfolding. But there is sci-fi romance, there is paranormal romance, there are just straight up murder mystery romances. There are fantasy romances where there's like sword fighting and dragons and so on. So there's a huge variety that exists in the genre, and it sort of changes all the time. It adapts all the time. The representation of what kind of people were seen as worthy of being romantic protagonists has changed. So when the form starts, especially in Britain, it really is all 100% of the time white people, and it's 100% of the time a heterosexual couple. And that has changed over time, especially as the US became a bigger player in there. So you do see people of color, and that's why I've chosen some of these covers. You see representations of both homosexual and heterosexual couples, people who identify as cis in their identity, as well as people who identify as trans or gender non-binary or gender fluid. So the form really constantly sort of adapts and changes over time, and that's where we kind of find ourselves at this moment. If we can move to the next slide, I'll talk quickly about what my current work is. So I've published 2 books on the genre. You saw one of the covers at the beginning, and there'll be one, my first book, the cover I put on the last slide. But I've written on romance heroes as sort of symbolic constructs and how they might represent notions of war, notions of heterosexuality, so sort of ideological figures. And my second book that just came out a few months ago is about romance heroines. And again, I study things like what does gender presentation for women look like, how that might have changed over time, what does it mean to express sexual behavior that is considered appropriate by women versus not appropriate by women, and how romance novels sort of deal with that. But my current project, which I've been working on for the last couple of years, is looking at BIPOC romance, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color representation in romance novels. And I've been specifically looking at 1980 because that feels like the moment when American romance publishing really started to sort of incorporate folks who are Black, folks who were of Native and Indigenous heritage, folks who were Latinx heritage, folks who were Asian American. And so I'm trying to build the genealogy of romance in the English language mass market. And so that's the work that I'm doing. Who knows, someday it might become another book if I completely lose my mind and decide to do that as another project and a full-fledged book instead of just shorter articles, which I've been publishing for a while now. So that's essentially kind of an overview, a little bit of what my own work is and what the history of the genre is. I know Rama had sent to me someone's query about, they wanted to know if I was going to talk about the history. So I gave you like a very sort of quick and dirty recap of what that's like. The current state of romance scholarship and study is also in flux. So there are people all over the world who are studying romance in different languages. It's not my specialty. So again, I told Rama when he told me the 3 things you had selected that I have no direct acquaintance with the Abhijaan Shakuntal because I did not read it as a child. I only know it through things like Amar Chitra Katha or like a children's version of it. I do not read Sanskrit or things that maybe my father or someone had told me about. So I know the story, but I have not studied that form. But I have colleagues and scholars all over the world who are studying romance in other languages. There's a lot of work that's being done in Spain, for example. There's a big bunch of scholars who study Spanish romance literature, both popular and classical. I know folks who are in the Philippines who are also studying their local versions of it. And all of this is the fiction and the novel form, but there are certainly people who study the cinema form. I've written and published on romance and Hindi cinema myself. People study romantic lyrics in popular music. People are studying romance in things like reality TV shows, in advertising, because it is used and deployed in a variety of places. So the current state of romance scholarship is very rich, and it's just sort of building. And we're always looking forward to like inviting more people to it. If we can go to the next slide, I'll just give people a little bit of a, if you're interested in kind of slides. So I currently serve as the president of our scholarly organization. It's called the International Association for the Study of Popular Romance, or we abbreviate it and pronounce it as YASPER. So it's an international collection of scholars, and we just actually had our conference in June of last year at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And we do those conferences now every 2 years, especially since the pandemic. So the next one will be next year, probably in Mexico at the university there. As all scholarly organizations and fields do, we have our own scholarly journal in which we publish open access scholarship so people can read these things for free. So those of you who are interested, I would certainly encourage you to look at that website because it is freely available. It is sort of standard peer-reviewed work. And yeah, there's the PBS segment that I mentioned. If people wanted to take a look and are interested in this it's not new and nothing is new, but this idea of romantic fantasy or romantasy, as they're calling it, as a new subgenre with is like dragons and sword fighting and things like that. And I'll just end with the cover of my first book. Like I said, I wrote on romance heroes. and studied again the 20th century mass market form of it. So that's a quick and dirty overview of what mass market romance fiction is, and that a lot of us love it, but we also take it very seriously in the scholarly setting. So again, it's a real pleasure to see people like you sort of dipping your toes into that particular genre. So thank you again for the invite.
Thank you, Professor Kamble. That was a very nice exposition to bring us all up to speed with contemporary romance literature. And you did it in a very scholarly way. So we appreciate that. It's okay for you to take a few questions now from all of us.
All right, so I'm looking at
Yes.
the chat. I see who are the South Asian authors in romantic BIPOC fiction right now. So Shankarji, it's still a small contingent, but there are several. So Sonali Dev is based in Chicago, I believe, and she's been doing a bunch of sort of rewrites of the classics with South Asian characters in it. So she has a Pride and Prejudice rewrite and a Sense and Sensibility rewrite. And so Pride and Prejudice is kind of the book that never stops giving. So every few years, somebody rewrites it and they put in their own twist and their own characters in it. So Sonali, I think, has some of those. Nisha Sharma is very young and she's, I think, just really starting out. So she's New York based, and I think she's actually last year started a PhD program in English because she also wants to do some scholarly work as well. So she's one of the young folks who are doing it. Another one is Alicia Rai, who I believe is a lawyer. So everybody pretty much has another job and is doing this for the love of the genre. So Alicia has done a variety of romances, and she also sort of edges into what is called erotic romance, which has much more sexually explicit material. So those are some of the ones that sort of spring to the top of my head as South Asians who are writing right now. There are some folks who are also think like Uzma Jalaluddin also writes, misspell her name. I want to say she's based in Canada. So she's also another sort of South Asian, North American author who's been. She has also has, I think, a Pride and Prejudice rewrite as well. So there's that. Let's see. Are there any men authors? There are. There are many men authors, and honestly, for as long as Mills and Boon has been around, there have been male authors, but in the past, there's often been the use of female pseudonyms by male authors writing romance because the genre is associated so powerfully with women and sort of the feminization of emotions that happened post the 19th century in the West, that a lot of the male authors actually wrote under female pseudonyms. That is less so the case now. So there are some pretty strong male authors who are writing, non-binary authors who are writing. So Alexis Hall is a British author who is very, very popular. So yeah, things are shifting a little by little in that sense as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Miller
There's
mentioned-
yeah,
yeah.
there's a question there from me, if you can see it.
Yeah, I do. I do.
Mhm.
Okay. So does contemporary romance literature differ across different countries in any way? There are certainly differences and sort of like national patterns that we can see, but the American romance market and the publishing industry is very, very powerful. So if somebody wants a kind of a global audience and sales, they really do follow the American template. And we often hear stories from authors, even from places like Australia and New Zealand, who you would think, again, right, like sort of part of the first world and English as their first language group, but even they are often told, well, let's not use like so many like New Zealand English terms. Let's not make references to cities in those parts. Like can we Americanize it in some way? So that's always a point of sort of grumbling from their side. But there are regional, like Philippines has a very massive romance author group, and they're definitely writing. So, for example, I remember seeing a scholar present on some Philippine authors, and they said that their novels don't end with like a promise of marriage. And the
Mhm.
reason for that is because divorce is still not allowed there. And
Mm.
so to actually have your characters promise marriage or get married is actually kind of stressful for the
Mhm.
reader and the writer, because it feels like they may never have a way out because
Mm.
divorce is illegal, which is not an issue really here, right? So it's an interesting
Mhm.
paradox that here you might have more happy ever after endings and wedding scenes and so on, because in the back of your head you kind of know that you have an out in a way that those folks don't. So they actually kind of leave it a little bit more open-ended. So that was one of the more interesting kind of like differences that I've seen in sort of the national or regional versions of the literature.
That's very interesting that romance literature in different parts of the world follows social trends or contemporary cultural patterns.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very much a
There's
reflection.
a question from Sandeep in the chat box, if you want to answer it. How is the
Sure.
line drawn between erotic romance and porn literature?
Yeah, so the key difference to me, and porn itself is its own field of study. So porn studies is a legitimate field, and so it's not my field of expertise. But what I will say is that romance fiction and romance novels, they're really committed to the idea that this is a unit, and that there are still going to be, again, social norms that we're going to follow
Mhm.
within that unit. Whereas porn, in every form, whether it's the written literary form or it's the graphic and visual form, is really interested in going against social norms. So porn gets
Mhm.
its power from the violation of boundaries, right? Of
Mhm.
challenging the social order, of challenging what we think is acceptable or normal. Um, so that's part of the delight of sort of pornography as a form. Whereas like erotic romance might have a lot of sexual episodes in it and descriptions of sexual activity, but it's made very clear from the structure of the story that these people will only do this with each other because they have a very strong emotional and romantic connection, which is an ideological construct after all, right? Like society dictates that we should only have certain feelings for certain people within
Mhm.
certain legally or socially acceptable kind of labels. So
Mhm.
romance still, to a large extent, stays there even when it has more sexual activity. So I think that's kind of the sort of key difference between those
Very good.
two.
Thank
Mhm.
you. There's a question from Suresh here. Dr. Kamble, do you conduct primary research in your line of work, such as interviewing subjects, etc.?
Mhm. So I confess with great embarrassment that I did do this during the writing of my PhD. So I did have surveys, and I actually used my surveys at my public library in Pune. So I went back and like collected data from there. But I'm not really trained in what's called ethnographic research. I'm not a sociologist. I was trained in English and cultural studies, but without that kind of
Mhm.
interviewing direct subjects kind of training. And so I have that in my dissertation, which is available online, but I kept it out of this first book because I did not think it was very solid research. And so it's not my primary way of working. I work primarily as a literature scholar. I study the text. Um, but I know a lot of folks who are readers. And so, sort of informally, I'm always informed by what people are thinking and saying. And certainly now, because of the internet, I have a lot of access to what readers are talking about in general. So it sort of informs the back of my head, but I don't formally interview people. And there are scholars who do that. And again, reader response and ethnography is a big part of a lot of popular culture studies. So I know folks who interview and take down the experiences of romance authors, and then folks who do a lot of reader research as well. So it's a pretty vibrant area of study. I've stayed away from it a little bit because, again, it's not really my area of training. And it's also very difficult sometimes for me to believe that there is some kind of epistemological truth that is coming out of talking to people about their popular culture consumption. Because the things that are in our head and the reasons why we read certain things or enjoy certain things may not always be the things that we're able to articulate or feel comfortable articulating. So it feels a little bit of a dead end. So I don't always go down that path.
Mhm. Thank you. You've been very kind and generous with your time, talking to us and answering these several questions. We would all be very happy if you stayed on with us for the rest of the session, but I do understand it's late in the day. So if you need to leave at any point in time, we will understand. But thank you very much on behalf of all of us for talking to us and enlightening us on romance literature in various ways.
My
And we
pleasure.
hope you will come back to the book club at some point in the future.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I might mute myself and turn my video off and try to stay awake as long as I can. So, because again, as a book lover, I'm always interested in what people have to say about things they've read.
Great. And all of my friends are thanking you in the chat box.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a
Pleasure.
Wonderful.
very,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Really.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we will move on to the next segment of this program. And before Rama takes over, I just want to say that in his hands, the wide sweep of this romance literature has attained new heights in so much as he's captured everything from Kalidas in the Gupta period that roughly matches with the 4th century to Daphne du Maurier's mystery romance in the middle of the last century to Charlotte Bronte's romantic Bildungsroman that comes from the middle of the century before the 20th one. So with that broad sweep, we should let him tell us something about romance before we listen to the reflectors. So go ahead, Rama.
Thanks, Milind. Yeah. I guess the first thing is that it is Valentine's month, and happy Valentine's Day to all the ladies, all the spouses, all the critical people in our lives, wherever they are. And if I can have the next slide, please. The genesis of this was also driven by the time I spent in the as a kind of like a student journalist, where I ran a gossip column called TDH, and it was called Tom, Dick, and Harry, supposed to be tall, dark, and handsome, and in a way it was just a gossipy column of what was happening, the going-ons in Kailash Hostel, which was the ladies' hostel of IIT Delhi. Some of it was also because I used to tease people about it. And in a way, this is a bit of that repentance when you bring all these together. And it is so impressive to see how broad this genre is. And given that we're a lot of analytical types, there's some data and stats over here. But I will ask you later on to tell me which do you think is the biggest or the number one author in terms of romance. If I can, Frankie, can you go a little down? So another quiz question for you is what limerence means. In any case, Dr. Kamble has already talked about, what happily ever after, HEA and HFN means. And I'm not going to belabor that. But what I want to tell you is that the thread that I've used to connect these three books has not only been the geographical spread or the time-wise historical spread, but also the focus on a woman as a strong individual, even though she's buffeted in a patriarchal world. And with that, I'll stop over here because I'd rather let the reflectors talk about it and talk in the way that they're seeing, because I was very passionate after looking at about 17 books that these are three that I thought you folks would like to hear about. And with that, I'd like to thank Milind and Yangs for humoring me when I planned out this session. Yeah, over to you, Milind.
But before we do that,
Rama.
who are the most popular authors?
Sorry.
Who are
The
the two
first
most
one
popular?
is 50 Shades of Grey. Did anybody get it? Come on, guys, you got to read it.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
No, you got to read it.
You got to see the movie.
Yeah.
And the movie is also very interesting. And the second quiz question was limerence. What does limerence mean? Now, don't Google it right now, but it's basically an obsessive desire for somebody. It's normally the romantic field, you know, and, you know, I hope this is not the point of a limerence over here, but it's a point about that you have a continuum of care, continuum of romance, and it goes from what are shared feelings to obsessive feelings. And limerence is at the other end of the spread.
Mm.
And with that, if nobody has got it, well, I'm sorry, it's set a very tough quiz for you guys.
Thank you, Rama. I think in your hands, like I said, this theme has really become very enriching for all of us, and I cannot wait to listen to all the reflections. So let's begin with Abdul taking on Abhijnana Shakuntalam by Mahakavi Kalidas. And in English, it's easier for me to understand the title as The Recognition of Shakuntala. So with that, Abdul, please take over.
Sure. Thank you, Milind. I get the slides on the screen?
Mhm.
Okay, good. Thank you. Every civilization finds its most eloquent expression in one writer who produces a magical alloy of mythology, history, and imagination. A brilliant tapestry woven with elements of sublime romance, overwhelming adversities, and difficult moral choices. Examples include Homer for the Greeks, Virgil for the Romans, Shakespeare for the English, cameos for the Portuguese, and more recently, Marquez for the Colombians. For India, the writer who unquestionably occupies that position is Kalidasa, whose works span many different genres. Epics like Kumarasambhava and Raghuvamsha, lyrics like Ritusamhara and Meghaduta, and most importantly, plays like Shakuntala. This play brings back a lot of personal memories for me because it was one of my textbooks which I had to study more than half a century ago. I was very lucky to have Professor Kurup as my teacher. He was one of the foremost Malayalam poets and subsequently went on to win the Jnanapida Award in 2007, the highest literary honor in India. The story of Shakuntala is well known to most of you, and therefore I will try not to recount the story here. It has been translated into most Indian languages as well as many foreign languages, sometimes multiple times in the same language. It has also been made into movies in many regional languages. However, the original itself is inaccessible to most Indians because it was written in Sanskrit. So that's a little bit of a difference between Kalidasa and the other writers that I mentioned. Others are still read in the original by the people of those countries, but in India, it has been far more difficult for the average person to read. The Amar Chitra Katha type of retellings are at best caricatures, which can hardly capture or convey the beauty of the original. Thank you, Rama, for getting us to read one of the greatest classics of our cultural heritage. I'll confine myself to just a few specific observations. The thing that impressed me most about the book is its contemporaneity, despite the fact that it is centuries old and most of its characters are drawn from mythology. Romantic attraction, abandonment, adversity, and eventual reconciliation are all age-old themes. But beyond that, there are any number of specific events and dialogues in the play that will not be out of place in a modern play such as Shakuntala finding an excuse to stay on for a few extra seconds in Dushyant's presence, her friends pretending that they have to find the mother of a deer cub so as to give Shakuntala and Dushyant some alone time, etc., are some examples. Surprisingly, the emotionally most touching and lyrically the most beautiful part of the book has little to do with romance itself. This is when pregnant Shakuntala, who had spent all her life in the secluded environment of the ashram, leaves for Hastinapuri to take on her new role as a wife and says tearful farewell, not just to the people in the ashram, but to each and every tree and the animals and so on. The universality of that experience that mixes the pain of leaving everything one has loved so far to join one's beloved is made all the more poignant by integrating humans with plants and animals and other creatures. This elevates the play into something more than a mere romantic love to a more holistic, universal love. Second, Mahabharata has been a rich source of material for centuries for Indian writers to build their own stories and their own interpretations. Apart from the stories of good and evil, heroism and villainy, it has been the source of material for a number of romantic works as well. Examples include the romances of Nala and Damayanti, Usha and Anirudh, and so many others. The Shakuntala Dushyanta story is of particular cultural significance because Sarvadamana, the offspring of Shakuntala and Dushyant, subsequently became Emperor Bharata, although many Bharatiya nationalists are unfamiliar with the story of Sarvadamana. According to legend, Sarvadamana had 9 sons from 3 women, all of whom turned out to be completely useless and unworthy of their father. He ended up adopting a very worthy son. Just a kind of tangential information. Third, when you read through Kalidasa's work as well as many Indian epics, one realizes that the dichotomy between gods and humans is a rather recent theocratic invention. In the ancient mythology, whether it is Indian or Greek or various other cultures, gods were different from humans, but they were neither almighty nor were they perfect. In Shakuntalam, for example, Indra, the king of gods, seeks help of Dushyant, a human king, in a battle. At various times, Indra has offered Ardhasana, that is half of his throne, to various human rulers in return for their help. Gods have human emotions such as jealousy and insecurity as well. That is why they sent Menaka to tempt Vishwamitra and break his tapasya. Shakuntala herself is half Apsara and half human. Thus, the universe did not contain the battle between clearly demarcated good and evil, but some sort of continuum where there were gods, Apsaras, Yakshas, Kinnaras, Gandharvas, humans, Rakshasas, Asuras, birds, animals, etc. There was good within evil. Remember from our earlier discussion that Duryodhana went to heaven, and evil within good people. The both good and evil resides within us, and that is one of the most important realizations from reading our earlier literature. My final observation is about Kalidas and his milieu. Despite the fact that Kalidasa is the most celebrated poet of the subcontinent, we know so little about him. We are not even sure which century he lived, with various estimates placing him between 2nd century BC and 5th century AD. That's a time range that spans a whole millennium. We do not know where he lived or where he died. Some legends locate him in Ujjain. Some claim he was from Kashmir. The Sri Lankans claim that Kalidasa died there. There is even uncertainty about which books he authored, with some people questioning whether Ritusamhara is really his work. We are not even sure whether Kalidasa was his real name or just a pen name. If we want to be critical, we can say that we are a historical civilization which has no concept of history as a sequence of events in chronological time. If we want to be less judgmental, we can say that we are not bound by the calibration of time into discrete units, and that our civilization's universality is not merely spatial but also temporal, And as the wheel of destiny turns in eternal cycles, there is no need to be attached to monochronic linear temporality. I think I'll stop my comments there.
Thank you, Abdul. That was such a beautiful reflection. I shouldn't say anything, but I cannot resist the temptation to share what I have seen
Brilliant.
in
Brilliant.
scholarly papers recently also, that the famous man of letters from Germany, Goethe, apparently read the Shakuntalam in Sanskrit and danced with joy with that whole tome on his head. So that was the beauty of the original, which is lost on us and perhaps lost in translation. But thank you very much, Abdul, for that reflection. And with
Thank
that,
you for listening.
let's move on to Nidhi's thoughts on My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. Go ahead, Nidhi.
It's not fair to put me after Abdul. It's a very tough act to follow. But anyway, here goes. Interesting little anecdote. You know, when I first started working in Bombay in 1981, the marketing manager of Mills and Boone was actually one of our first clients. So I remember meeting this rather overweight Englishman in Bombay and he asking me to take him around to the grocery stores. He thought that, like in England, Mills and Boons would be sold in grocery stores. I was totally stumped. I took him to the local kiranas. There were no Mills and Boons to be found. But then he gave up after some point and just decided to spend the rest of his time in this hotel. But I do remember that. Okay. My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier was published in 1951. But it is set sometime in the 1800s in Cornwall, England. It's a classic story of mystery and love. Love for a guardian, love for a woman, love for home and country. Ambrose Ashley is the owner of a large country estate on the Cornish coast and has been guardian to his orphan cousin Philip since the latter was 18 months old. Ambrose is a confirmed bachelor, and both he and Philip are content to live in a household populated solely by men. Neither feels the need for a woman in their lives. They think a woman's presence would mar the harmony of their all-male household. Ambrose suffers from rheumatism as he reaches his 40s and is advised to winter abroad in a dry, warm country such as Italy. On his third winter abroad, Ambrose writes that he's met a cousin of theirs called Rachel, the widowed Contessa Sangaletti in Florence, and in the spring Ambrose says that he and Rachel are married with no immediate plans to return to Cornwall. Gradually, the tone of Ambrose's correspondence changes. He complains of the sun, the stuffy atmosphere, terrible headaches, and says that he can trust no one and that Rachel watches him constantly. Philip discusses the contents of the letter with his godfather Nick, who on Ambrose's death will become Philip's guardian until his coming of age at 25. Nick suggests that Ambrose may be suffering from a brain tumor, as his father had before him. Philip travels to Italy and reaches the villa where he learns that Ambrose is dead and that Rachel has left the villa. When Philip returns to Cornwall, Nick tells Philip that he's received a communication from Rinaldi, who is Rachel's friend and lover, lawyer, I should say, that was a Freudian slip, containing two pieces of information. The death certificate confirms that Ambrose's cause of death was a brain tumor. And as Ambrose had never changed his will in Rachel's favor, Philip is still heir to the estate. 2 weeks later, Nick receives word from Rachel that she's arrived by boat in Plymouth. Philip invites her to stay with him and a harmony develops between them. One day, a tenant from East Lodge gives Philip a letter from Ambrose written 3 months before his death. In it, Ambrose tells Philip about his illness and talks of Rachel's recklessness with money and her habit of turning to Rinaldi rather than to him. Finally, he wonders if Rinaldi and Rachel are trying to poison him, and he asks Philip to come and see him. Rachel later shows Philip an unsigned will that Ambrose wrote, in which he leaves his property to Rachel. The reason why I'm going through this entire story in so much detail is that I think you need to understand the sequence of events to really evaluate the story. Anyway, continuing on, by now Philip has fallen in love with Rachel and refuses to believe any ill of her. In a grand gesture, he decides to transfer the estate to Rachel. He also gives her the family jewels and they make love. The next day, Philip announces that he and Rachel are getting married, but this is news to her. She states that she wishes to go back to Italy eventually, but that she will visit frequently and invites Philip to her villa. Due to the shock of Rachel's refusal to marriage and or a midnight swim that he had had, Philip falls ill with meningitis and Rachel nurses him back to health. But she does make it very clear that she plans to return to Italy once he's in good health. And she continues to rely on Rinaldi for advice. One time, Philip searches her room looking for a letter from Rinaldi, and by mistake finds the seeds of the poisonous laburnum tree in a packet, a tree that he had noticed in the Italian villa as well. Now, Rachel is a skilled gardener with a knowledge of potions and brews. She's often helped the tenants on the estate. And in fact, it was she who had identified Philip's illness as meningitis, since the English doctors were unfamiliar with it, and it was she who had suggested the treatment plan. But Philip is mad with jealousy and unhappy with Rachel's desire and her refusal to marry him. And he's convinced that Rachel is trying to poison him like what she did to Ambrose. So one evening, with the help of his childhood friend, they look through Rachel's papers and they find out that not only has she returned all the family jewels that Philip had presented her with, but she's also named Philip as her heir. Now they begin to wonder if they've misjudged her. But earlier, the estate foreman had warned Philip not to walk on a bridge that looked okay but was just a framework. Philip intentionally doesn't tell Rachel about this when she goes for her walk, knowing that she will walk on that bridge. And sure enough, the bridge collapses and Rachel finds her broken body among the timber and the stone. He takes her in his arms and she looks at him, calling him Ambrose just before she dies. Philip knows that he is responsible for her death, and the book ends with the statement, "They used to hang men at 4 turnings in the old days, not anymore, though." So I guess my question is, who's the real murderer here? Rachel or Philip? I think that Rachel, perhaps she was a murderer, but Philip definitely was a murderer. Anyway, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It was an easy read. Lovely description of a time and a place, a mystery of did she or didn't she, and actually very interesting social commentary on the attitudes of typical male English landed gentry in the 1800s. There are many admirable things about Philip, his loyalty to and his love of his cousin Ambrose, along with a mild dislike of and general avoidance of women. He has a love for the land and the tenants. He's not greedy. He's happy to pass on his inheritance to Rachel when he's in love with her. He has a sense of honor, duty, generosity. But with that, there's also a dislike of foreigners and foreign places, and assumptions about what women's actions mean. Just because Rachel sleeps with him, he assumes that she'll marry him. There are lots of comments about how he could see foreignness in her eyes and bafflement. She couldn't understand the ways of England. And in the end, it seemed to me that what was love for Ambrose and Philip wasn't really love for Rachel. Both Ambrose and Philip wanted to have control of Rachel. They wanted her to conform to what they thought she should be. Whereas she says, when defending her friend Rinaldi, "Here's a man who has stood by me through every trial and trouble, who's never misjudged me or tried to see me as other than I am. He knows my faults, my weaknesses, and does not condemn them, but accepts me at his own value." While clearly both Ambrose and Philip projected their own ideas of love onto her, did not understand her really, demanded something from her that she did not give, and both ended up labeling her their torment. So that was
Thank
my
you.
take on the book.
Thank you so much, Nidhi.
Super.
Your
Well
storytelling ability is very good. For those of us who did not read My Cousin Rachel, it gave us a very good idea of why this must have been a very good mystery romance to read. So really thank you for that and your reflection on it. And to get to the finale of these reflections, we finally have Vinita's sociological perspective, knowing that she's a teacher, professor of sociology on Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. So please go ahead, Vinita.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Yes, I've tried to do it in a very different manner, not, I mean, sociologically, because for me, narrating a story is not very exciting. So I kind of gave my views and opinions as Rama had given me the freedom to do that. So can I'll start. You can give, yeah. So Jane Eyre is a famous work written by Charlotte Bronte in 1847. I mean, just one small comment, and that this is actually one of the earliest romance novels that were written and is a precursor to most of the other romance novels that came about later. It is set in the English countryside and is based on the author's own life experience. It is an amazing love story. The author, through Jane Eyre, has expressed women's desire for equal rights that were denied to them, together with a life of dignity. The author shapes a tough and independent woman in Jane Eyre who pursues true love and equality. So I'll give a little background to Victorian society. That has been, I mean, it's important background for the story to understand. That's, yeah, okay. So society in this period was highly male dominated and controlled. Women had no voice. They were not viewed as individuals with rights of their own, but only as property of men. Their future lay in getting a husband. The only other avenues lay in becoming teachers or governesses, or else remain spinsters. Education for women was associated with preparing them for domestic roles. Literature was not their business. Hence, those who wrote did not want to reveal their female identity and therefore wrote under pseudonyms. Georgette here is an example. George Taylor, I think the name, is an example. Charlotte Bronte also published Jane Eyre under a pseudonym that did not reveal the sex of the author. The name she used was Currer Bell, a name not distinctly male or female or masculine. Can I, yeah. In Victorian romance novels, women were the main protagonists. Ironically, they were from an inferior background, while the man was an aristocrat. A lot of novels that we read during college days, other than Charlotte Bronte and all of them that, I mean, I remember also reading, all had, you know, the men who were from aristocratic families, like whether it was in Barbara Cartland, Victoria Holt, I mean, whichever one, I mean, generally we found this. These novels stressed on social inequalities in terms of class and gender. They were read mainly by women. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, now coming to the story per se, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre opens with Jane, an orphaned 10-year-old girl living at Gateshead Hall with her aunt, Mrs. Reed, and the Reed children. Eliza, John, and Georgiana, they dislike her intensely. Jane is harassed and oppressed by her cousin, John Reed. When she resists his abuse, she is punished. There are several examples of how Jane has been very rebellious right from her early childhood. She later moves to Lowood School. One second, sorry. Lowood presents a new set of problems for Jane. During her 6 years as a student, Jane rises to the top of her class. She then stays on as a teacher for 2 more years. She grows up to be strong-willed and independent. In search of new experiences, Jane later accepts the post of a governess at Thornfield, a large, beautiful estate, and becomes a governess. Here she falls in love with her employer, Mr. Edward Rochester. When Jane comes to know that Mr. Where is it gone? Yeah, has a wife, she does not hesitate to walk away. Can I just go to the previous page? Sorry. In search of new experiences. Okay, no, it's okay. Jane accepts the post of governess at Thornfield, a large, beautiful estate, and becomes a governess. Here she falls in love with her employer, Mr. Edward Rochester. When Jane comes to know that Mr. Rochester has a wife, she does not hesitate to walk away. She says, "Sir, your wife is living. That is a fact acknowledged this morning by yourself. If I lived with you as you desire, I should then be your mistress. To say otherwise is sophistical, is false." She has, I mean, the interesting thing here is, and in this period where women were so shadowed and covered, she stood her ground. It shows her strong character. Okay, can we move on? Having been cheated in love, Jane flees. 3 siblings, Mary, Diana, and St. John Rivers at Marsh End, give her refuge. St. John Rivers tries to coerce her into marriage, but she stands her ground. Later, she returns to Thornfield to find it a burned wreck. She then discovers that Bertha Mason, that is Rochester's first wife, has burned the house down one night, and that Rochester lost an eye and a hand while trying to save her and the servants, and that he now lives in seclusion at Ferndean. The story ends with Jane marrying Mr. Rochester, and then they live happily ever after. This is what was mentioned earlier by Dr. Kamble when she was talking about all romance novels having a happy ending. A typical end to a romance novel. Jane Eyre's story tells us that in a man-dominated society, a woman should strive for decency and dignity. In face of hardships in life, the courageous women should be brave enough to battle against it. Self-esteem is the primary element to protect.
Thank you very much, Vinita. That really told us what Rama meant by his choice of strong, courageous women.
Yes.
With your illustration of Jane Eyre. I just wanted to note that the pathos that follows romance has been vividly depicted in all the recommended books for today's romance theme. And it was captured so well by Abdul, Nidhi, and Vinita in their beautifully written essays or reflections in today's session. So thank you all for all your contributions. And with that, I'd just like to share a poem which I hope will resonate with most of us. The title of the poem is Another Valentine by Wendy Cope. Today we are obliged to be romantic and think of yet another Valentine. We know the rules and we are both pedantic. Today is the day we have to be romantic. Our love is old and sure, not new and frantic. You know I'm yours and I know you are mine. And saying that has made me feel romantic. My dearest love, my darling Valentine.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So with that, our program for today comes to an end, and we can transit to the open session where we'd like to listen to all of your thoughts on the discussion on romance. Please go ahead.
First thing is, I have to read my first Milton. I've never read a Milton.
It'll be good
I think same
education
here.
for you.
I have to confess too.
And then and then follow it up with Harlequin romance, and then you see the
I
difference.
thought Mills and Boon was supposed to be read only by girls. So I was happy
Hey,
with.
I thought the only difference is the American spelling versus the English spelling. Isn't that the case, or are these two different Mills and Boonses?
No, there's only one.
I thought Harlequin is like just the American publisher of the same book.
Yeah.
But what does
I
it
think
even
the
mean, the
way
word
they-
Harlequin?
Harlequin has titles is a little more racy than, well, the Mills and Boon that I read ages back.
I mean,
But
that's
even
what
Mills
Harry
and Boon-
Potter does too, right? I mean, the Sorcerer's Stone, or
Mills and Boon also, over a period of time, underwent a lot of changes in the books that came out. Changes which were reflective of changes in society.
Yeah, I was surrounded. I had two sisters, so I was surrounded by lots of Mills and Boons. I attempted to read it once, but I was pretty disgusted. I found it pretty meaningless. And it was not only Mills and Boon. There was another writer, Barbara
Cartland.
Barbara Cartland. My God.
Barbara Cartland.
Tanku, I think you're
Unbearable,
only saying this for the
unbearable.
benefit of all the women in the class. You're not really.
Danko, there was also Georgette here. Don't you remember your sister?
Yes,
reads
yes. Yes, absolutely. And as I said, I developed a distinct dislike for all the Mills and Boon type of books.
That's the
But
reason
perhaps
why I
I
wanted
should read
to
it now. Yeah. I was silly. I was a
Well, it was
silly
never meant to
brat.
be serious reading. Mills and Boon was never meant to be serious reading.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
just one of those that you could pick up and, go through in a couple of hours and done.
Jayashree
Yeah.
has a comment.
Yes,
So
very
if you
Yes, there
recall,
is a
we had a
romance play
library in our
titled-
hostel, right? The library in our hostel had plenty of fair share of Mills and Boons and romance novels. I don't know if any of you guys ever borrowed and read them. I certainly
I
did.
didn't even know there was a
But
library.
Deepa,
Yeah, I also didn't know
in
there was a
IMC,
hostel.
in
library.
IMC,
Yeah. In IMC, they used to be like there used to
Yeah,
be
student
a
run
little
hostel library.
library, and there used to be quite a few books there, and there used to be Mills and Boons as well over there.
I must confess I was arrogant and I just didn't go to that part of the library. I went for other books there in the library.
because some of us never went to the library.
I never went to the library. Simple.
Yeah. I once went into and I was searching for some interesting books, and then I saw a snake skin that had been shed there. I just ran after that.
There's a very telling comment by Professor Kamble in the chat box. She says there is a romance for every type of reader. So
No, I must clarify that while whatever I've said about Mills and Boons is okay, but I'm not against romance. So I love romance, and
Tanku, you look like you're sitting in a Mills and Boon setting. Like man in hammock, chair in garden.
Yeah, that's why I said I am
We won't
romantic
ask who's in the other chair.
in my own way.
Bad network.
yeah, someone with a good network, please speak.
So let me
Anyone
ask a
else?
question.
I tell you, I'm just
great-
very happy to be born today rather than 100 years ago. Those women had it
Even
tough.
if
I mean, I guess the men
the
did too, but the
Iron
women
Book.
had it horrible. Like Vanita was talking about Jane Eyre, I mean, no options in life other than to find a husband.
Yeah, it's really grim, isn't it? It's very
Yeah.
Very true, Nidhi. In fact, when I was talking to Milind about the book club, the fact I mentioned was my mother was stopped from studies after her class 4 by my uncles, because they said that a woman should not be going to the school and seen by the boys. And she was a voracious reader, and then she self-learned lot of things in life, and she was inspiration to me and my brother for the education.
Interesting.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
And-
often the case. Yeah.
So,
No,
so
we have
is it
to-
therefore that in England all women couldn't get married? Was there a problem? I mean, I don't know. It seems so from Jane Eyre's story that every woman did not find a husband.
Or indeed, all the Jane Austens, right?
And actually,
Well,
But
it
I
went
think,
actually.
Chancellor, you may be right because I mean, generally the ratio of women to men is anyway a little bit higher in nature. And then you look at the wars and all in which the men had to fight and die. So it's quite
Correct.
possible that there were more women than men. And
Yeah.
therefore, every woman couldn't find a husband.
And hence, this was the condition they were, kind of, yeah.
Well, you remember on our Russia trip, the woman, our guides saying how the divorce rate in Russia was so high because there were many more women than men. Men could basically play the field. And she also mentioned that genetically the men were the worst because all the good men died during World War II. It was the prisoners and deserters who are the forefathers of current Russian men. This is what the guide was saying. So I think all that does play a role.
And
Okay,
actually,
guys, I'm going to drop off, but I just wanted to tell you,
Okay.
I'm reading lots of stuff,
Good.
and here are all the 3 books, okay, for next month.
Mhm.
Um,
Good.
Nice
All
Thank you
right.
choice
for
of
being
books,
here.
Trivi. Very
Yeah.
interesting choice of books.
Thank you. I hope everyone enjoys reading at least one of them. They're all really good reads, and yeah.
They seem pretty
And,
long.
Which are the 3 books?
Are we
They
going to
are
follow the
shown
same?
by Srinivas. It's on today's program, Nidhi.
Okay.
Are we following the same theme that
Same
Innovation.
methodology.
No,
for the
Innovation
last
innovation.
is
two
the theme.
sessions?
No, innovation is the theme for Shankar and his next session in March.
The methodology we are following is the same?
Yes,
apparently.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. For 3 months.
But did
until
everyone
March.
read one book? I wonder, did everyone actually read one book? The whole group,
No.
like, did Gautam read a book? Did Sharath read a book? It's kind of interesting, right? Because before you would give us an assignment, Professor Shrikandi. We had to read it because otherwise we'd be
now you've
embarrassed,
read 3.
Now you can read, and
Shankar, each person was part of a group. So I'm just assuming they have read
Okay.
at least